Horizon just homes with reaction. This is why Israel is invading Gaza by channel Real Life Lore. My god, it's an hour long video. Yeah, I was thinking like why hasn't Real Life Lore uploaded a video about this? I've been waiting for it. But obviously he was taking his time for an hour long video. Yeah, I'm guessing he's gonna cover all the history and everything there is to cover. Because it's an hour long, right? This is really fucked up conflict. I don't know. Look, I don't know if I have OCD or what. I don't know. But when I think about things, I really think about them deep, like a empathetic perspective. And when I think about this, it's just like I just go blank. I don't want to think about this at all because it's just like when you're a kid, you don't realize this, but when you become an adult, you realize there's way too many things that are just out of your control, out of most people's control. At that point, what you're gonna do? If you think about it too much, you're just gonna get depressed. So this is one of those things that I just stop thinking about it. Right? Because this is like a modern thing, right? There are videos of people getting abducted, things like that. You basically know like nothing's good gonna come out of this. Like it's gonna be really fucked up by the end. No result is gonna be good, right? This is not a movie, right? Nothing good is gonna come out of this. So after knowing all this, it's just like, it's just depressing. So I just stopped thinking about it. Like, fuck this, I don't want to think about it. Something like that. But it's too horrible, man, right? I don't know. And also all these idiots in social media basically having debate over like stand with who and not. Some people stand at this side, some people stand at this side, having no idea what the fuck they're talking about. Getting all the news from Facebook or something. It's just like you don't know nothing, right? Past 6 or so years have shown us that like propaganda and fake news is much higher. They realize that social media is the tool to spread this, and people just take that and still run with it. You think by now people realize that social media news might not be real and let's not take that on its word. But no, all this fucking fight and things. There are idiots who basically like, cheer for one side. Like both sides are, suffering, right? I mean, when I've said in the past, like, okay, maybe Israel should chill out a bit with everything. But when you hear about all the things that Hamas did, you think like, okay, I understand what Israel doing, but this and that. But with the other side, with the Hamas side, right? Hamas is not entire Palestine. And now entire Palestine is also suffering. Both sides are getting fucked up, right? And anybody who just like cheer for one side and just actually hoping for something bad for the other side, is just like both have innocent people involved in it, right? That the people are suffering, right? And any celebrities is like, innocent people are suffering. I stand with no side. Innocent people are suffering and, I don't like that, whatever. People pissed off about that as well. Like how on the center and generic somebody could say it and you're still pissed off. Like what, you want them to take a stance or something without having any information? 99% of people have no knowledge of what the fuck they're talking about, like basic knowledge at best. Even then they don't. This is one of the most complicated issues on the planet and they're still gonna talk shit about it, which kind of pisses me off. Like, come on. So I'm hoping channels like this, Real Life Lore, will basically really educate people at that level, because one thing I know about Real Life Lore is that he can really go in deep. He can cover all the topic in really well, perfect way. So yeah, let's watch one.
This video is made possible by Nebula.
Wait a minute.
This video is made possible by Nebula. Use the link down in the description below to support Real Life Lore directly by signing up, where you can watch dozens of additional and exclusive full-length videos in my ongoing Nebula Modern Conflict series, covering recent major wars and crises, including this video's next part covering the entire history of the wars and fighting between Israel and Gaza from the 1980s to the current conflict today. On the 29th of September 2023, the United States National Security Advisor, who reports directly to the president, Jake Sullivan, was speaking at the annual Atlantic Festival, listing off all of the accomplishments that the Biden administration had achieved in the Middle East. After years of brutal warfare that had resulted in more than 300,000 deaths, a 19-month-long truce in civil war-torn Yemen was continuing to hold. The long-running civil war in Syria was beginning to stabilize and settle down as well, while Bashar al-Assad, the longtime Syrian dictator, was finally being welcomed back into the Arab League again after more than a decade-long suspension over his handling of the war in Syria that had claimed the lives of more than 500,000 people. Brokered by China, Saudi Arabia and Iran had finally agreed on restoring their relations in March of 2023, after having been severed 6 years previously. Brokered by America, Saudi Arabia and Israel were also on the cusp of normalizing their relations. Iran's attacks against American military bases had stopped, and there was a general sense in much of the world that the chronically violent and unstable Middle East was at last beginning to calm down and enter into a new era of peace. Jake Sullivan himself summed up the general foreign policy mood in the region during that speech on the 29th of September, when he said the following.
And the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. Now, challenges remain. Iran's nuclear weapons program, the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. But the amount of time that I have to spend on crisis and conflict in the Middle East today compared to any of my predecessors going back to 9/11 is significantly reduced.
It would only take 2 weeks for those words to immediately come back and haunt him. On the 7th of October, 2023, various Palestinian militant groups led by Hamas, the organization who rules in the Gaza Strip, launched a highly coordinated surprise land, sea, and air offensive against Israel. They managed to fire at least 5,000 rockets against Israel, while around 2,500 armed Hamas fighters managed to break through the walls surrounding Gaza and infiltrated into multiple villages of Israel itself, where they massacred at least 1,400 Israelis and other citizens in a single day, wounded more than 5,000 others, and took around 200 more as hostages back into Gaza. The attack represented the single bloodiest day in the entire history of Israel, and the first time since 1948 that a hostile outside military power managed to break into Israel proper. It all came as a
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I still remember that clip. Was it some kind of like an event going on or something? It was like an open ground, and they were just like on bikes and things, just like kidnapping people, and so somebody was like literally pleading like "don't kill me" type of thing. It's just like, that is a haunting image, not gonna lie. Like, that's such a haunting thing when you really deeply think about it, right? It's just like, I still remember that. I don't think I'm gonna forget that image for a long time, right? I mean, I know people who just basically watch world news and things like that. It's just like, okay, one of those things that they just saw. I'm not that. I don't watch world news that way, right? And like I said, I think about things way too deep, empathetic way, right? And whenever I just think of this image, like, okay, what's going to happen to those people? Basically, we know the answer of that. So yeah, it's just like so haunting to know this like actually happening right now.
Profound shock to the state of Israel, which has since responded with an unprecedented declaration of war against Hamas in Gaza that was followed up by the rapid mobilization of 300,000 Israeli reserve troops, the largest and quickest call-up of reserves in Israel's entire history. The 16-year-long Israeli blockade of Gaza then subsequently transformed into a complete and total Israeli siege of Gaza, with the Israelis blocking off all electricity, fuel, telecommunications, water, and medicine from passing into Gaza through any of their territory by land, sea, or air. The Israeli Air Force began initiating a punishing aerial campaign across the Gaza Strip that saw more than 6,000 Israeli bombs dropped across the territory within only the first 6 days of the war beginning. More than double the amount of ordnance that the United States-led coalition dropped in an entire month in the war against ISIS. As the Israeli airstrikes continued on the 13th of October, Israel ordered that more than 1.1 million Palestinians immediately evacuate from the northern Gaza Strip towards the southern Gaza Strip within 24 hours or be potentially considered as enemy combatants. And then 2 weeks later, on the 27th of October, the Israeli ground forces launched their full-scale invasion into the northern Gaza Strip. And as of the production of this video, have Gaza City, the biggest city in Palestine with a pre-war population of more than 560,000 people, completely encircled. Once the Israeli ground forces push into Gaza City, they will likely experience what many military analysts believe will be nothing less than the most ferocious urban combat seen in history since the Second World War. While Israel's stated military objective going forward is to completely destroy Hamas as an institution and its estimated 40,000 fighters held up in the Gaza Strip, while securing the release of the more than 200 hostages that they continue to hold. And in pursuit of those war aims, the Gaza Health Ministry, run by Hamas, claims that, as of the production of this video, the Israeli airstrikes and ground invasion have already killed nearly 10,000 Palestinians within the Gaza Strip and wounded nearly 25,000 more, in addition to the estimated 1,000 or so Hamas fighters who were killed within Israel during the initial October 7th invasion. A truly catastrophic.
Okay, what do you think? What are those number of those people are probably just civilians, not really combatants, right? Terrorist combatants that has anything to do with Hamas. How many of you that you think are citizens? Because I know this, I would just leave the northern Gaza. It's like that simple, right? So I don't agree with a lot of things that Israel is doing. But then again, like both sides basically can have argument, right? Palestine side can just basically say like, okay, Hamas did this. We're not all Hamas. Israel can say like, okay, all this damage and everything. Like, what you want us to do? Not respond, not do anything. What, just leave things be, so repeat of this can happen in few years again. So it's just like I don't even know what to think at points like this. It's like one of the most complicated shit of all time, I guess.
Catastrophic war has thus once again returned to the Middle East, and the longer that the war continues, the longer it risks spreading like a contagion to drag in multiple other powers into an even greater Middle East-wide war. The brief era of peace and stability in the Middle East has once again been shattered. And in order to understand why this is all suddenly happening right now, you only have to go back a few years ago to 2017 in order to understand how the countdown to war in October of 2023 began originally ticking. By the time that 2017 rolled around, the de facto geopolitical situation of the area was roughly the same as it had been for the past decade ever since 2007. How it got there in 2007 was a very, very complicated story. But to cover through it all very quickly, the British Empire acquired this territory in the Eastern Mediterranean known as Mandatory Palestine after defeating the Ottoman Empire in World War I, who had ruled the area for centuries beforehand. Most of the people who lived in the Mandate at that time were Arabs, but Jewish immigration to the land was increasing in scale as the Zionist movement in Europe sought to flee increasing anti-Semitism in places like Russia and later Germany, by establishing an independent Jewish state in the land of their ancient ancestors. The British openly stated that they would support the creation of a Jewish state in Mandatory Palestine through the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Though with vague and undetermined borders. As more Jews increasingly came to Mandatory Palestine, especially after the Nazis rose to power in Germany, the Arabs of the territory resented seeing more of their land getting taken over, and so they revolted in 1936. The British squashed that rebellion, but they attempted to placate the Arabs by restricting further Jewish immigration and land purchases within the Mandate. But this policy angered Jewish groups in the Mandate, and so Jewish militant groups formed who launched their own rebellion, and violence between themselves and the Arabs escalated even further. By 1947, the British decided to give up and withdraw from Mandatory Palestine altogether, and so they submitted the matter of what to do with it to the United Nations, who, in the wake of the Holocaust in Europe, faced growing international pressure for the creation of an independent Jewish state. They came up with the 1947 UN Partition Plan, which called for partitioning Mandatory Palestine into 3 separate.
So British like, oh, we are the mediators. We can do this. We've always been this British Empire, and they realize, oh my God, it's too much. You know what? Fuck this. United Nations, you can do it. Just walk away. There you go. Classic.
States, an independent Jewish state, an independent Palestinian Arab state, and an internationally run city-state in Jerusalem. The Arab side, in particular, resented this proposal at the time, though, as they argued it was too heavily biased towards the Jewish side, who were granted most of the Mandate's land, despite only representing about 1/3 of the Mandate's population at the time. The Jewish side, meanwhile, had misgivings about the plan as well, since most of the big cities and the actual arable land went to the Arab state, while Jerusalem itself was surrounded by Arab territory. But nonetheless, the Jewish side ultimately accepted the plan, while virtually the entire Arab world condemned the UN plan and rejected it. And the violence between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jews in the Mandate only worsened. In 1948, Israel declared its independence from the Mandate based on the 1947 UN plan boundaries. But the Palestinians and a coalition of outside Arab states refused to recognize them and immediately invaded, determined to overturn the UN partition plan that they saw as just another form of colonialism, seeking to steal more of their land. But Israel ended up winning that war and agreed on an armistice with the Arab states who attacked them in 1949. The so-called Green Line marked the military front line between the Israelis and the Arab states as it stood when that armistice agreement was signed. And though all of the Arab states at the time were very clear that the Green Line did not mark any final or agreed-upon borders, it did mark the de facto border between themselves and Israel nonetheless. At the same time, the Gaza Strip fell under the control of Egypt, the West Bank fell under the control of Jordan, while Jerusalem itself became divided between Israeli control in the west and Jordanian control in the east. Israel's own expansion well beyond their originally accepted 1947 UN partition plan area also put them in control over over large swaths of Palestinian Arab lands, which resulted in about 700,000 of them who either fled or were forcibly pushed out in an event that became known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, with many of them fleeing towards the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and others towards Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And so an independent Palestinian state was immediately extinguished. At the same time, in 1949, there were approximately 1 million Jews of Mizrahi and Sephardi ancestry who lived all across the Muslim world as their ancestors had for thousands of years. But over the decades that followed, as Israel established itself further, the vast majority of them were either forcibly expelled, fled, or voluntarily migrated away in a mass Jewish exodus away from the Muslim world, and largely towards Israel. As a result, few...
Yep, there you go. Obviously, it makes sense when Israel is there, has formed like Jewish state now. Why would those people stay in these Muslim countries when they can just basically go to their own Jewish country, which is now Israel? So that makes sense. And some of them, like you said, also was forced out. Look, to me, obviously this is where the divide comes from. People will just like, there'll be people who saying like, okay, this is like colonialism, whatever, right? Like, this land belonged to the Islamic countries, Palestinians or whatever. Why did they come, this and that? Even though this land belonged to Jewish people, right? Long before, it's in written in the Bible, right? Bible is obviously religious text, but it's an old text, right? This whole area is that. Now, obviously, you will have both sides saying that. One side, Israel, supporting side would basically just say that, okay, that they are there, right? It has to be two-state solution, right? They are, Jewish people are just agreeing to this. Israel people are just agreeing to this, like coexisting. One side is not agreeing. Other people like us would say like, okay, this is just like, how every other Western country has done, like just, forcing the native people out. I'm gonna have just one stance, like two-state solution has to be there. Like the whole Hamas's thing, like you have to remove every single Jewish people. That's just absurd. That's ridiculous and horrendous at the same side. And the more fucked up thing is that the leader of Hamas, if I remember correctly, as Paul says, most Palestinian people prefer the leader of Hamas, even though they don't prefer Hamas itself. Like it's like how it's like two things go together. I don't know what to say of that. So it's like, if the Native Americans in USA, if they were like in a lot of numbers, today if try to overthrow all the American people, would that be justified? That would be similar to this, right? All the American people that are right now there, right, that would be like equivalent to Jewish people in Israel. Would that be justified? So all the people who just like supporting, Hamas's side basically. And this is in the end, like I said, this is like Hamas versus Israel, even though people are, stuck between the, gunfire or whatever. Hamas is the one who launched the attack, right? It's not just point blank about Palestinians. And one thing I've gathered, which might be not the full news, but that Israel is, agreeing to basically, have compromise, while Hamas is clearly not having any compromises. So, at that point, like, it becomes kind of clear, like, where the fault is at, right? You cannot take on both sides, like, okay, which side I agree with more. You can have, like, I agree with Palestinian more, but at the same time, like, are you going to agree to give Native Americans your USA and leave for Europe or something? You're not going to do that. So what do you mean you agree with Palestine, right? That they are there right now. Doesn't matter what happened 70 years ago. Doesn't matter who has claim, because both have claim. They are here right now. You have to agree with two-state solution, right? Saying that all the Jews has to leave, that's just like, no, that's not going to work. That's just stupid.
Fewer than 30,000 Jews continue to live in the Muslim world today, down from around 1 million in 1948. Today, these Middle Eastern and North African Jews who left and their descendants comprise more than 50% of the Israeli Jewish population and represent the country's single largest ethnic group today, while another 32% of the Israeli Jewish population are of Ashkenazi ancestry from Eastern and Central Europe, who represent the second largest group. Ever since that time, both the Palestinians and the Israelis have struggled defining where one of their territories begins and the other ends, within the overall territory of the former British Mandate, and have struggled with achieving universal recognition by the outside world. Israel's mostly internationally recognized boundaries today consist of that so-called Green Line dating back to 1949. But there were also the additional territories that came under Israel's control during the later Six-Day War of 1967 that lay beyond the 1949 Armistice Green Line. territories that are usually referred to as either the post-1967 territories or the Israeli-occupied territories. They include the Sinai Peninsula seized from Egypt, the Palestinian-inhabited territories that Israel seized from Egypt and Jordan, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights that were seized from Syria. After Israel seized all of these territories back in 1967, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, which effectively considered them all as occupied territories that the Israelis should immediately withdraw from, while the Arab League convened at Khartoum in Sudan, where they proclaimed the 1967 Khartoum Resolution, explicitly laying out their foreign policy towards Israel going forward. No peace with Israel, no recognition with Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. A policy that became known as the Arab world's 3 no's, and the foundation upon which no Arab state would recognize Israel's existence in any context or shape for decades. Over the decades that followed from 1967, Israel treated each of their post-1967 acquired territories very differently. Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in 1979 in exchange for a formal peace treaty with Egypt and Egyptian recognition of Israel's right to exist, marking the first time that an Arab state would ever do such a thing, and the first time that an Arab state would violate the 3 no's agreed upon by the Arab League back in the 1967 Khartoum Resolution. Israel then unilaterally decided to annex all of East Jerusalem in 1980, and subsequently proclaimed a unified Jerusalem as its own capital city, something that the United Nations would immediately declare as legally null and void under international law with Resolution 478, that considered East Jerusalem to still be an Israeli-occupied territory, and which also called upon all UN member states to withdraw their embassies from Jerusalem in the aftermath, which everybody eventually agreed to do. By the time 2017 rolled around, there wasn't a single other country in the world outside of Israel who recognized Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem or Jerusalem as the sole capital of Israel. Israel also decided to unilaterally annex the Golan Heights outright back in 1981, an action that the United Nations similarly declared under the passing of Resolution 497 immediately afterwards as null and void and without international legal effect. The Golan Heights would continue.
So that's Israel annexation of that in 1981. This is why people are worried about Iran, right? During this conflict, like Iran could basically sleep in because that happened in 1981. So basically, they could try to take it back now, because obviously, even internationally, nobody recognized that. So yeah, that is interesting. So there is still a chance that this conflict could become even larger now. By if Iran gets involved, I think US might get involved. I don't know.
Continue to be universally recognized by the entire international community as Israeli-occupied territory of Syria for decades, and this also continued to remain true by 2017. That left the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which Israel has also treated very differently from all of the other post-1967 territories. Egypt renounced its claim to the Gaza Strip in the peace treaty with Israel in 1978, while Jordan formally renounced its claims to the West Bank and East Jerusalem a decade later in 1988, before becoming the second Arab state to make peace with Israel and recognize Israel's existence in 1994. Those renunciations by Egypt and Jordan to the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and Israel's continued internationally unrecognized occupation of all of them, left them each effectively as Palestinian-inhabited territories trapped in a state of permanent legal limbo for decades, as thousands of Israeli settlers began moving into all of them and displacing and angering the Palestinians who lived within them even further. After decades of violence between the Israeli authorities and the settlers on one side and the Palestinians on the other, in both the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, the Israelis and the Palestinians eventually agreed upon the Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995, which established the Palestinian Authority as an interim Palestinian government body that was eventually assumed would, one day, take over full authority in the entire occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, as the eventually fully independent state of Palestine. But in the interim until then, the Israeli and Palestinian sides agreed on what originally was supposed to only be a temporary division of the West Bank into 3 distinctly different areas with varying levels of control between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military and state. Area A would be the territories assigned entirely to the Civil and Security Administration run by the Palestinians.
So these yellow parts are annexed by Israel, huh? But then why is it shown in this like a West Bank? Wouldn't it be just already part of this border? Area C, full Israeli civil and security control. Full Israeli civil and security control. Oh, so Israeli is controlling that anyway. Palestine civil control and Israeli security control. Full Palestine civil and security. Okay. So dull greens still have like somewhat Israeli control, while these bright greens are the one that have Palestinian control fully.
Authority. Area B would be the territories assigned to only the civil administration run by the Palestinian Authority, but with a security administration that would continue to be run by the Israelis. And then there was also Area C, which would continue to be entirely run by both the Israeli civil and military authorities, without any influence from the Palestinian Authority at all, which effectively placed Area C under the continued de facto control of Israel. Area C consists of approximately...
I don't get it. Like, why not give Palestinian their own control, have them form their own government, two-state solution? That would work, right? See, all the conflict I see, and obviously right now I still blame, obviously, Palestinian, mostly Hamas, right, for this. But sometimes even with the response of the, I felt like as Israeli can basically chill out a bit, right? Response differently, even things like this. I'm like, couldn't they just, like, I don't know, again, probably coming from ignorance without having much detail. But if they're given Palestine, West Bank, it's probably, obviously, like I said, Palestine, they would have given them full control and let them form their own government. Wouldn't have cooled things a bit? I don't know. Gaza and West Bank being Palestinian state, let them have their own thing. That would have been better. I don't know. I think things like this, like, raise tension no more.
Approximately 61% of the West Bank's total territory, and is presently the home of all of Israel's settlements and settlers in the West Bank, wedged all in between the Palestinian Authority's Area A and Area B, and ringed all around Jerusalem, where more than 99% of all the land is either strictly off-limits or heavily restricted for Palestinians to access. Area C is also completely contiguous in area, while the Palestinian Authorities administer territories in Areas A and B are not contiguous, and divided between 165 separate enclaves in between the contiguous Israeli-administered Area C, that is chock full of Israeli settlements in a situation that has sometimes been referred to as the Palestinian archipelago of the West Bank, and a system that has been very frequently compared to the system of apartheid that white-ruled South Africa enforced upon their black population until 1994. It was initially intended by the Oslo Accords of 1995 that all of Area C would be gradually transferred by the Israelis over to the Palestinian Authorities administration. But to date, that has never ended up happening.
Exactly.
Within 1 week of the
fuck?
Oslo II Accord being signed on the 28th of September 1995 that established the system of Areas A and B in the West Bank and granted the Palestinian Authority limited control, the Israeli Prime Minister who signed them, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated by an Israeli right-wing extremist who was opposed to the concept of any independent Palestinian entity. And the next election that came the following year in 1996 brought Benjamin Netanyahu into the office of Israel's Prime Minister for the first time, which resulted in a stalling of any further negotiations between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. The supposedly temporary divisions within the West Bank agreed upon in 1995 immediately before Yitzhak Rabin's assassination have remained indefinite ever since. And the pace of...
Look, even in America right now, which I don't know, again, like, that's the best example I can have right now, there are Indian reservation that are like control as, like, those native Indians have control over them. So even in America, after all the effed up thing and happened, right? Look at the Thanksgiving, right? All the bloody thing that happened. This native Indians have their own areas, right? Which is like, if I don't know which video was it? Was it CGP video? I don't know. Which basically talked about how these are not considered part of USA. They are their own thing, type of thing, right? I mean, obviously at a whole level, when it comes to security, it's all going to be USA. But mostly it's just like run by them, right? Reservations and things like that. Even there's a case like that. Now in here, like, okay, I get it. Like with the Jewish state, Israel is formed. There's a West Bank and Gaza is literally Palestine area, right? Obviously the way they decided, letting them have their own thing, have their own government would have been better, two-state solution. But even then, doing shit like this is probably raised tension, right? Like say, like, Arpak Gallagher, whatever that he said, basically, spots of places where Palestine is, other places just still Israel is there, right? Not letting them have their own government, still having security and civil power with Israel, even though it's supposed to be Palestinian place. So things like this probably raise tension even more. So, it's like, there is no one side you can agree on when you see shit like this. This is why it's very complicated. There's no one side you can agree on, right? When problems lies with both sides, what you're going to think, right? So I don't know. Only solution in future is like letting go of the past shit and just having two-state solution. That's the only thing that makes sense. Anything else will have issues.
of Israeli settlers moving into Area C has only continued. At the current date in 2023, it's estimated that around 230,000 Israeli settlers live in the post-1967 territory of East Jerusalem, while another 470,000 Israeli settlers live within Area C of the West Bank, across at least 132 separate settlements and more than 140 separate outposts, where they have full civil and political rights like every other Israeli citizen does, and representing a four-fold increase in Israeli settlers in the West Bank since the Oslo Accords were initially signed in 1995. This is in comparison to around 300,000 Palestinians who also live within Area C and are subject to Israeli military rule. Another roughly 2.8 million Palestinians who live confined within the Palestinian archipelago of Areas A and B under the Palestinian Authority's administration in the West Bank, and another 362,000 Palestinians who live within the Israeli-annexed East Jerusalem, all of whom have almost zero say over how they are actually governed. Israel's continued control over Area C in the West Bank for decades and hundreds of thousands of settlers that they have allowed to move into the territory since the 1990s have been frequently labeled as a violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which plainly states that, quote, "The occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory that it occupies," in this case being the West Bank. Meanwhile, by 2005, Israel maintained about 8,000 settlers across 21
I mean, that is shady as shit, right? I mean, that's just so fucked up. I mean, I don't think most people... See, that's why I love real life lore, right? All this, like, spots of Israeli basically being in West Bank. When they talk about West Bank being Palestinian, Gaza being Palestinian, I don't think most people realize that it's not fully Palestinian. It's just like barely spots of them that are Palestinian.
different settlements in the Gaza Strip, but by then, the situation was becoming untenable. At only about twice the size of Washington, D.C., the Gaza Strip was geographically much smaller than the West Bank was. But with a population of 1.4 million Palestinians back then, it was also substantially more densely populated and urbanized than the West Bank was as well. The high costs associated with defending only a few thousand settlers in this crowded urbanized territory was becoming too costly for Israel to bear. And so, in 2005, they decided to unilaterally withdraw from the Gaza Strip altogether. All of the 21 Israeli settlements inside of it were destroyed, all 8,000 Israeli settlers within Gaza were either evacuated or forcibly withdrawn, while the military withdrew as well, and for the first time, the entirety of the Gaza Strip's land territory was passed over to the Palestinian Authority. Although Israel continued maintaining control over virtually all of Gaza's land crossings, with a fence they constructed around the entire territory back in 1994, along with continued control over all of Gaza's airspace that included Israel's destruction of the only airport in the Gaza Strip back in 2002. And then, finally, came the Palestinian legislative elections of January 2006 shortly afterwards, in which the political party known as Hamas achieved an unexpectedly decisive victory. Before then, the Palestinian Authority had been always controlled and dominated by the secular, socialist, and Palestinian Arab nationalist party known as Fatah, who had initially sought Israel's total destruction and the establishment of a secular, Palestinian Arab socialist state over the entirety of the former British Mandate area in its place. But it subsequently made peace with Israel during the Oslo Accords and then restricted their ambitions to establishing an independent Palestinian state limited only to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip instead. By contrast, Hamas was a Sunni Islamist and Palestinian nationalist party who argued that Fatah had become too complacent and too cooperative with Israel and had abandoned the true original Palestinian cause. Hamas continued to be fully committed to Israel's total destruction, the same way that Fatah had used to be prior to the Oslo Accords. And separately from Fatah, Hamas advocated for the eventual establishment of a Sunni Islamist Palestinian state across the entirety of the former British Mandate area once Israel had been completely destroyed. After a brief civil war within the Palestinian Authority between Hamas and Fatah, Hamas emerged victorious within the Gaza Strip and pushed Fatah out completely by the middle of 2007, which has ever since led to a continuous division within the Palestinian leadership. The Sunni Islamists of Hamas based in the Gaza Strip, who are fully dedicated to Israel's total destruction and the eventual establishment of a Sunni Islamic state across the entirety of the former British Mandate in its place, and the secular, socialist, and nationalist Fatah based in the Palestinian archipelago of the West Bank, willing to work together with Israel to eventually
see Fatah's vision is like kind of like makes sense, right? Like I said, like West Bank and Gaza being Palestinian state while other being Israel, the way it is, like that makes sense. Okay, that may be peaceful, even in people of Israel don't want that. That's why the last president was assassinated. But okay, that can be seen. But the Hamas's vision of like removing entire Israel, that's just like, that's never going to happen. So yeah, the conflict is going to be never ending if that's your vision.
Establish an independent Palestinian state based on the entirety of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, while recognizing Israel's own borders based on the 1949 Armistice Green Line, the same way that Egypt and Jordan do. But Israel responded to Hamas's uncompromising takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007 by initiating a complete land, air, and sea blockade over the territory that harshly limited the ability of Palestinians or goods to exit or enter. A blockade that Gaza's other neighbor, Egypt, agreed to fully participate in on their side of the border.
Okay, you know what? Only thing I can basically say about this, that look, I think people needs to do something, right? If the entire people of Palestine support Hamas, then all people are to blame. But I don't think that's the case. So at that point, people of Palestine basically needs to revolt and say Hamas is not the one that represents us. Because the way Hamas is conducting is like terrorist as a terrorist can be, right? Their goal is horrendous, right? All of this cannot happen. So it's in the hand of Palestinian basically, right? They have to do this, right? It's like, how after, whenever like something like a major war happens, every Palestinian is going to suffer, right? They are the one has to like rise up and say like, screw the Hamas is not us, basically. Because if they don't do it, like look at all the shit is happening right now, right? Everything like Israel has to respond with, right? How many innocent people got injured, right? Land, sea, air blockade that hurt people of Palestine. Way too many innocent got caught in this because of what Hamas represents. So at this point, like you have to like vocalize, right? People would support you if you vocalize like that, like Hamas is not us. But if you don't do this, like people just assume like all Palestinians are just basically support of Hamas. But at that point, we'll see you same as they see Hamas. That's a problem. So yeah, this is just fucked up, man. I don't know what to say. I don't know where it's going to lead. I'm not keeping up with the news because I don't want to. It's just horrendous, right? It's just, I don't know, man. I don't know where this is going. It's like already Russia-Ukraine thing is going on, but there you go. Now this is also escalated, especially where like the video said like everything was going well. Everything was calming down and then suddenly this happens. Now this is going to have ripple effects. Even something that doesn't have anything to do with Israel and Palestine somewhere else is going to cause instability there as well. So every other place like instability is going to rise up in the Middle East. Right, well, I'll pick up this later maybe. This was why the Israel-Gaza war is really happening on the channel Real Life Lore. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you next time.